well, today this is really your show and your chance to talk to Pete about whatever you want. Given that you're here, we'll give you a heads up as to next month's plans, which are a little bit different. We're actually going to have two books, sort of. One, and both by Tyler Cowen. One will be his book, Stubborn Attachments, and the other, we're going to talk about GOAT, his online chat GPT book about the greatest economist of all time. And you'll see a lot of action on that within the portal. So hopefully you're all game to participate. And the books should be going out, I think, next week. Is that right, Shel?
Mm-hmm. Stubborn Attachments, and then the E. Are both of them ebooks?
What's that?
Are both ebooks?
No, we're sending out actual books of Stubborn Attachments, and then I'll put the link for the GOAT in the portal, and we can talk about it there, so we can sort of weave our discussions together. So
okay. And Shelly, I'll get you the stuff before the end of the weekend. Sorry.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, well, this is your show, you guys. Pete, take it away. I'm going to mute myself, and I'm anxious to hear what all you want to talk to Pete about. Remember, you can talk about the book that we're reading, the books that we've read, the books that you want to read, or whatever else within reason.
The state of the world. I will try to address whatever people ask. So just raise your hand and jump in.
Okay.
I can't figure out how to raise my hand right at the moment. Can I jump in?
Yep.
One suggestion for a book. I read Randy Barnett's Structure of Liberty.
Yeah, it's a good book.
Yeah, I would think that would be a good pairing with, the Selden, the Kersner book, and
it's a good suggestion. I am doing some archival work at the moment, and Amy will appreciate this. Part of the archives is digging out old Liberty Fund conferences that were very quite interesting conferences. So this is one in which it's on efficiency and a free society. It's Mario Rizzo put it together at NYU, but Buchanan. And in Buchanan's response to Rizzo, when they're picking different authors, one of the books that he mentions and the author is a book that had a huge impact on me as an undergraduate, but very rarely do people read it today. It's by David Norton, called Personal Destinies. And I really like this book, Personal Destinies. It's kind of similar to a more recent book by Agnes Callard on aspirations, or even a better book that's in this same genre might be Lauren Lemaski's first famous book, which is called Persons' Rights and Moral Community. And Lemaski would be a good guest too. We might not get anything done, but you'd have a lot of fun with him. But yeah, that's a great. Larry White has some classic books as well that are very valuable. So we should, Amy and I will take those down and we'll think about those suggestions. So thank you, Scott. Those are great.
Yeah, can I just
Randy Barnett's book is very, very good.
Yeah.
And it was a classic. When I was a kid growing up in this intellectual world, the way you progressed through the world was you went to FEE as an undergraduate, so the Foundation for Economic Education, and then you went to IHS when you were a graduate student, and then you got graduated to go to Liberty Fund when you finally, finished graduate school. And it was kind of a progression like that. And so Randy Barnett was one of the main people teaching in the IHS programs when I was a graduate student. And I saw early versions of that Structure of Liberty book like years ago before he published it. He's moved quite a bit to the right, as you might know, after 9/11. But the Structure of Liberty is actually still in a genre in which he was extremely a libertarian thinker.
Yeah.
9/11 sent him on a wrong path, in my opinion. So, but I'm a weirdo in that regard. So
that was just my one suggestion. Since you mentioned Larry White, his latest book on money, I think, is a great one as well. could I ask the question that I wanted to actually ask? I'm not going to be able to make it to the salon this month. And on the Kersner book, I was curious. His concept of a discovery
Finders
theory.
keeper ethic.
What's that?
His finders keeper ethic.
Yeah, basically. How well accepted is that? I have a friend who's a philosopher and talks a lot about the weaknesses in Locke's and the Lockean proviso.
Uh-huh.
And he gravitates more towards Henry George and a flat tax, single tax kind of system. Is Kersner's discovery concept well accepted, hardly accepted? And then I'll shut up. Thanks.
My impression is that it is accepted only by a very small number of people. But that's because the book is a rather difficult book for you guys to read. It's a dense book, and he is very much deep in the weeds trying to address a justification of profit that goes all the way back to economists like Frank Knight and others who were puzzled over how you can justify profits. And Kersner is trying to address that issue. And I think it's a very profound book. And my guest next week will be a great guest for you to ask questions about that. He's a very, very effective economic communicator, and he's thought long and hard about this piece. His very first published paper was on this issue of Kersner's notions of justice and discovery. He was Rosalino Candela is an economist, but his training was with Doug Rasmussen. So it's important to keep that in mind. He comes out of that philosophy background and then did economics later on. And so, David Schmitz has commented on Kersner's Finders Keeper of Ethic. But other than that, I don't think Kersner has gotten the kind of traction. He's certainly not the kind of traction that like Nozick has about, his versions of justice and stuff like that. So there's a lot of work left to be done. Part of the reason for the Liberty Fund Collect It Works was to try to highlight more of the contributions to make it easier for people to access Kersner's work. I think his work on entrepreneurship in general is well regarded and part of the conversation, but the implications that he draws from that are less so. And so there's a lot of work for the next generation to make that be the case. Okay, go ahead, Finn.
Yeah, before I get to my own question, I just want to comment a little bit on the Kersner book. I like the way he reinterpreted Hayek's discovery concept for competition, or the economy between search and discovery. I find it kind of new and refreshing in a way too. And now to my question. Have you considered asking Kersner himself to be the guest, or is he like too old for that?
So Professor Kersner is 94 years old,
Yeah.
and just last month was 94 years old. He is still very active, but his focus is on his role as a rabbi. So he still has a congregation. He's an Orthodox Jew, and I imagine that the last year has been very difficult for him because he has 13 kids, and they are all in rabbinical studies, either married to a rabbi or they became rabbis. I used to kid him all the time. I said, not an economist in the bunch. Come on, we've lost this gene pool or whatever. Like, you couldn't have at least had one economist. And many of them live in Israel. And so I imagine it's been rather rough for him and his wife over the last, 8 months or so, I guess. This has been going on. So I did not reach out to him for that reason.
I see.
He also doesn't use modern technology in the same way that you or I would use. So I'm not even sure he would know what Zoom is.
Okay.
I'll tell a funny story about him, though, which is that when I was teaching at NYU, he became obsessed with the OJ trial. Okay. But he didn't have a TV in his house, so he listened only to the radio. And he had to concentrate on the radio. So if you tried to call him while the trial was on, he would tell you, I can't talk to you now, the trial's on. So I was like, man, this is bizarre. Like, why is this guy so obsessed with this OJ trial? Well, we were having an internal departmental squabble at the time, and I was trying to look for some, senior recruits. And one of the most famous professors at NYU was a guy named Wesley Leontia. And he's a Nobel Prize winner. And he also was Israel's age, probably a little older than Israel. And I called him at his house. And he also was listening to the OJ trial and told me he couldn't talk now because of the OJ trial. And so I'm like, what the hell is with all these people or whatever? But my wife and I were actually out for lunch in the village, in Greenwich Village, at a French Vietnamese restaurant. And again, the verdict came in. They stopped everyone in the restaurant and turned the TV on that they have in the back, and played it on blast so everyone could hear what the trial was. And that's how I found out about OJ. It was like such a bizarre, anyway. But yeah, both Kerzner and Leontief, they followed it like to the T.
Wow.
But he, if you said, I've corresponded with him in recent years, and Mario Rizzo has corresponded with him as well. And he still responds back and is very gracious and everything like that. But his attention is more drawn towards rabbinical studies. His father was a very famous rabbi, and so Israel's taken over that kind of role.
I see. That's interesting. Never knew that about him.
Yeah, he was an amazingly impressive person as a faculty member to work with. And just to explain his work ethic, every week we had a seminar in which we had outside guests. And there was not a single time that you showed up at that seminar that he did not have marks on his reading from page 1 to the last page of the article. He read everything so intensely and so deeply. He's just a scholar. He really is. And so if after you read this book, if you feel a little, that you're ready for a deep dive, start with his dissertation, which is the first book in the series called The Economic Point of View. It's a very, very, what's the right word? Am I saying this the right word, Amy? Terse? I don't know if that's a right word. I need a teacher here to correct my English. But it's a very dense book, but extremely subtle. I mean, Kerzner is a very subtle and rigorous thinker. I also think, going back to Scott's, I think we should do a thing on Murray Rothbard's For a New Liberty, which is another book. That book had such a huge influence on me as a kid. And it is in many ways was like my Bible when I was in college. But I always you guys are all old enough, maybe not you, but most of us, you might remember the comedian Gallagher. Gallagher used to put up like a watermelon. He would smash it with the thing, and that was like part of his shtick or whatever. And I always used to describe Murray Rothbard as like the Gallagher of libertarianism, right? He would put it up there and he'd smash to get to the core of the argument. Whereas Kerzner was like a fine, carpenter who used like a fine knife to whittle down to get to the core.
Oh, yeah, for sure. That's the impression I get from him.
If you're pairing, like, Rothbard is not subtle. Like, that's the one thing you can say about Murray Rothbard. There is not a subtle bone in his body. He's, right? Whereas Israel is like the most subtle thinker, maybe too subtle at times, but he if you appreciate the subtlety and the intensity of it, yeah. Yeah.
And I just got one last thing.
Go ahead.
Okay. So in January, we read from Viktor Frankl, and I recently found out that this Alpine Symposium from 1968, that like a bunch of natural scientists attended. Even Hayek was there, and he contributed an article to it.
Huh. So, what's the article title that
yeah.
Hayek?
primarily the abstract.
Yeah, it's a brilliant article. Yeah.
Yeah, I've read that one, and the one from Viktor Frankl is one. It's sort of his logotherapy, but he taken sort of a anti-reductionist view to it.
Yeah. I mean, look, Hayek, this is a different point from Kerzner, but it's relevant. So, academia has all kinds of dysfunctions, okay? But it also has various different sorting mechanisms on quality of minds. All right. And so one of the things that you meet when you meet like really, really superstar professors is that they just have a quality of mind that is just better than the average Joe. So, I was fortunate enough to be a student of Jim Buchanan, and part of his shtick was, he's this Southern guy, talk with that Southern accent. And, he would say like, all that matters is that you keep, the consistent application of the butt of your seat, seat of your pants to the seat of your chair. Right. And all these things like that. And it was all about work ethic. But the reality is that Buchanan was working with an engine that's just, better than the average Joe. Right. I mean, he's and that's why he won a Nobel Prize. Vernon Smith, same thing. They're just like that. Kerzner is of that kind of mind in that regard. And Hayek obviously was even like slightly of that, because he walked in the circles when he moved to Chicago. The very first paper at his seminar was given by Enrico Fermi.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And so Hayek walked in that rare air with those type of people. And I was talking to a philosopher just last week, and they had no idea about Hayek's philosophy papers. And I was like, oh, you should go read them. And she's like, well, where did they ever publish them? And I'm like, British Journal of Philosophy of Science, Ethics, places like that. And she was like blown away, because she was like, oh, really? Like, I just thought he was an economist, like writing, because, in her mind, Hayek is the road to serfdom, not all these other, things. And so I think, being and living and dwelling within Hayek's writings, it's really quite shocking. In my own experience, like I said, I was very influenced by Rothbard as an undergraduate, and then Mises as well. And I still am both very influenced by both Mises and Rothbard. But when I went to graduate school, I did this like deep dive into Hayek. I started with Law, Legislation, and Liberty, ironically, because the books were surplus and they just were in my office. And I read volume 1, which is all about, spontaneous order and things like that. And then I read volume 2, then I read volume 3. And I remember walking away from those, like just blown away by the idea that, wouldn't it be awesome if you could become a scholar like that? With that kind of depth of reading, that kind of things like that. And, I mean, Amy will appreciate this. I feel that same way about Adam Smith. The reason why Adam Smith talks to us today is precisely because he just, he dug deeper in the human condition than authors at his time and since him. It's the reason why we keep reading him 300 years. He's 300, his birthday was celebrated last year. And it's just, it's just, there's just so much there. And then it's surprising when you think about how much is there at the same time as what they had available to them as information compared to us.
Yeah, for sure.
So see, Hume, on the other hand, is also, I really love David Hume, but Hume is more like Nozick in the sense that he likes to be snarky. And so he's like, there's a sense in which he's playing with ideas, like a cat playing with a mouse, and they're amazing at it, but it's like, it's just all play in some sense. Whereas you don't get that same sense with a Smith or a Hayek that they're playing. It's something that this is like their deep, and same thing with Buchanan, that this is like their deep commitments that they're trying to explore. That's a judgment. I may be completely wrong, but that's how I think about it. But yeah. So, yeah. Beyond rationalism, is that what or beyond reductionism? Which one was
reductionism? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Taylor.
I had just, I had one quick follow-up on Kerzner and his idea about discovery. I put it in chat, maybe you saw it. Is Kerzner not, his ideas about discovery, are they not accepted because they've been rejected or because they're just not well known? I have another question too, but that's kind
So so I'm biased, right? So to me, my view is that if people read Kerzner, they would accept his argument. So therefore, the fact that they don't accept his argument must mean that they didn't read him. I can't tell you if that's true or not, but that's my gut feeling. Is that he's too economistic for philosophers, and he's too philosophical for economists. And so in some sense, he misses a market, except for like a market of 10 people in the world.
Yeah.
And those 10 people think very highly of him.
Yeah.
Right. But like,
were there papers written that explored it and rejected it, or just?
No, the only paper that takes him on is by David Schmitz. And that's in Advances in Austrian Economics. And it's a paper where Schmitz tries to say that the finders keeper ethic doesn't work all the way down. But again, to the extent that like the Arizona school, which is a very important school of political philosophy, it was headed by David Schmitz and Jerry Gauss. And they championed an idea of what they called non-ideal theorizing. So, Gauss has a book called The Tyranny of the Ideal. And their argument is that in a lot of political philosophy, people postulate worlds that are ideal worlds that could never be populated by human beings. And they postulate these worlds, and then they have a theory of justice for this world that no human could ever live in. And so what they wanted to do was they wanted to bring political philosophy down to the touchstone of the real world. So it would have to be populated by real living human beings. And so what we should have, so Schmitz uses the metaphor all the time of, a neighborhood, right? So how is it that you get justice in your neighborhood, right? And so that's called non-ideal theory. So they relied a lot on economists to pull them into that world. And in this regard, if you're choosing between Hayek, Buchanan, Kerzner, right? What's going to get left off, Eleanor Ostrom, what's going to get left off more or less most of the time, unless you're trying to deal with like environmental issues or whatever, is going to be Buchanan, Buchanan or Hayek are going to dominate the discussion, because they were, first of all, they're Nobel laureates. And second of all, they were the ones that worked in that space before they invented the idea of non-ideal theorizing, right? They were the ones trying to already, do all this stuff. And so they're the natural people to do it. I like to say about, people like Hayek and Buchanan is if you have a 2x2 matrix and you're talking about theorizing, right? And you think about theorizing that can be abstract or concrete or realistic and unrealistic. A lot of people think that the abstractness and the unrealism are the way we do science. So they do abstract, unrealistic theory. The classic example is Milton Friedman's, the realism of our assumptions don't matter. But when you're like a Buchanan or Hayek, what you're doing is you're abstract, but you're realistic. And it's that box that they're trying to work in to develop social science. And that's what non-ideal theorizing tried to get into. And so the philosophers that were most likely to talk about them, okay, we're not going to talk about Kerzner. They're going to talk about Hayek and Buchanan. So they focus on the social justice criticism that Hayek offers in chapter 10 of the second volume of Law, Legislation, and Liberty, or Buchanan's various exercises about thinking about these kind of issues rather than Kerzner's. And the earlier philosopher, Nozick, he was writing before Kerzner would have written this. So he at times recognizes Kerzner's theory of entrepreneurship, but he doesn't have the implications, right? And so he has a different theory of justification of property, right? Sort of that's Lockean and all of that. Long-winded answer.
Yeah.
Is there a second question?
Yeah, that was my preliminary small question.
Oh, okay. Amy, teach me to do this. That's what my mom used to say.
I was just kind of getting ready for this. I went back and I read an article you and Chris Coyne wrote about a year ago called New Thinking in Austrian Economics.
Yeah.
About kind of the.
Thank you for reading it. Yeah.
about the research agenda and the work that's been going on and so forth. And it all seems really interesting. And it seems promising, but is there any kind of growing recognition in the mainstream of some of this work?
Yeah.
And is that even important? And I guess my ultimate question is, and it goes, I guess, back in a little way to the question about what should economists do, but
Yeah.
Can the Austrian approach be influential in policymaking at the highest levels? What would that take?
All right, now you just threw a couple more things in there that are kind of tough.
Yeah.
So I'm doing this archival work, right? And so here is a letter from 1971 from Jim Buchanan about to Henry Manny. Amy will appreciate this because it's a response to Manny's article on universities, right? Which we've talked about. And Buchanan says the following thing. He's referring to Tulloch. He says, perhaps, Tulloch is right when he suggests that there's entrenched and large bureaucracies that can continue to exploit the taxpayer donor almost without limits. If so, and if we accept your model, look what this means for the curriculum. This implies what this implies has already happened in economics in 1971. He says, and even more about other social sciences and humanities. We get a selection process working so as to remove genuine value more and more from the curriculum that is offered. There is essentially no feedbacks that will work to discipline this, right? He says it becomes, it becomes quite possible that the whole disciplines and subdisciplines costing millions will evolve, that they are the modern equivalent of the scholastic arguments about angels on heads of pins, with no more value than that. Professional economists can be trained to manipulate Jacobians, lattices, these various different functions, and to teach their students to do this without either having learned even the crudest notions of the market system and nothing about economic institutions that exist. What could you possibly do to prevent this? That's in 1971, okay? So this is where, the sort of mainstream, so the article that you read, one of the things I should point out is that was published in one of the leading citation journals of mainstream economics. So in the Annual Review of Economics, it's a journal that was founded by Kenneth Arrow. It's like it's not a heterodox sort of journal. Okay. The second thing is that Chris and I also edited this book with Oxford, right? Which is a big book, called that. If you email me, I can send you a PDF of it if you want. But we did that with Oxford. Now, okay, that much said, you are right that, people aren't listening or being persuaded. But this goes back to your first question, which is, why aren't they being persuaded? I don't think they're reading. So right. I have to I think of myself in a really weird way, like Biff in the old, Back to the Future ones, when he goes up to McFly and he hits him on the head and he says, McFly, that's what I'm trying to do to the economics profession, right? And trying to get them to pay attention. And they don't like to get hit on the head, so they don't pay attention, right? So then you got to figure out other ways to maybe get their attention. And one of those is applied work, right? So as I told you, I started my career as a Sovietologist. And, my dissertation, which had very little to do with Austrian economics per se, but my dissertation won the top dissertation prize from the Economics Honor Society. And I was, honored at the AEA meetings and all stuff like that. Because I was on it. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not because of my sheer work. It was pure timing, right? I wrote this book. My dissertation was written precisely as the Soviet Union was collapsing. And I was explaining the history of the Soviet Union. So, of course, people are like, oh, my God, this guy was on top of it. If I would have written that book 5 years earlier, no one would have paid attention. If I wrote it 5 years later, everyone would have said the market was saturated. Who the hell cares, right? But I was just at the sweet spot and I got lucky in that regard. It didn't translate into sales, by the way. I remember they when they came out with the book, they were going to charge $50 for it. Okay. This is in 1990. Okay. $50 for this book. And I remember saying to Rosemary, well, I get 10% of each sales. That's 5, books. This book will probably sell 100,000 copies. We're going to have a lot of money, and that didn't happen. Instead, the book, kind of got remaindered, basically, which is, but, I think applied work like that, economists that care about those issues, they want to pay attention and they learn it. And so there you can talk to them there, but what they do is they forget the underlying core ideas. So again, like Kerzner, I think one of the highest quality minds in modern Austrian economics is Mario Rizzo at New York University. And I would recommend, I'm writing a paper which is trying to arbitrage between these two articles of his, but let me just mention them to you because I think they're brilliant. One of them is, especially for Scott, you mentioned the book by Barnett. Rizzo's in law and economics as well, but not from law, but from economics. But he wrote this fantastic paper called Law Amid Flux, which compares and contrasts the economic analysis of law with a kind of law and economics that would follow if you take these more dynamic considerations into account. And I really recommend that paper. And then there's another paper that he wrote called Genetic Causal Explanations in Economics. Again, extremely difficult paper to work yourself through. But I think if you take the time to do it, it's just the rewards are huge. But that paper was published in 1996. The paper on law amid flux was published in 1980. Is the lack of the fact that Rizzo hasn't had, say, the impact that, say, Larry White did with banking. Larry White gets paid attention to in banking or whatever all the time. Is that because Rizzo failed or because people didn't read Rizzo? And I cheat. And so whenever my heroes don't get listened to, I think, oh, you didn't read them. So we need to figure out a way for you to read them. And whenever my heroes get caught in dead ends, I say, look how pregnant their work is. It has all these ambiguities that we have to tease out and work with or whatever. Whereas if my enemies, like say Amartya Sen ends up in a dead end, I'm like, look how screwed up Sen is. He has nothing to say. We move on. That's completely biased and not the way you should approach scholarship. And I get out of that quickly, from that equilibrium. But it is my first. Unfortunately, it's my first impression of things. So
just one final comment. Yeah. You talked about applied economics.
Yeah.
It's just kind of off the wall. I happen to be, I do economics tutoring.
Yeah.
I'm tutoring a guy now who's taking Raj Chetty's course.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of interesting.
So first of all, Chetty's a genius. Second of all, if you ever see Chetty present, he's unbelievably smooth, right? I mean, it's like watching, a TED Talk on steroids, okay? And so he's just a unique human being, very talented. What I think is the difference is that because he's all focused on the big data stuff, he has millions of data points. And this is the only thing I would say. It has nothing to do with the tutoring. It just has to do with Chetty and the Opportunity Project at Harvard. So one of their big studies was to take 8th graders in zip code, let's call it A, and then an 8th grader in zip code B that have the same aptitude test. And then what they're going to do is longitudinally study where they end up in income 15 years later. Okay, so same aptitude tests, where are they? And what you find is that in zip code B, which is richer than zip code A, that what happens is the person there goes way ahead of that, okay? Now, what's interesting, he has millions of data points on people, on scores, on places, okay? So he has everything about people and places, but what he talks nothing about is practices. And what determines the outcome? So zip code is not a destiny. So it's all turns on practices, right? And what is the practices that are going on in zip code B that are not being mimicked in zip code A? And that might explain the difference, but he doesn't talk about any of that because they don't know how to talk about that because that's not a data question. That actually is a economics question about incentives and stuff. So I think one of the big problems with Chetty, super brain, super genius, super smooth, but he's given up economic theory because he thinks, oh, it's all about the data. And he doesn't recognize that data is not the same thing as economics. Statistics isn't economics. But that position is extremely minority position. The position I just laid out is extreme minority position today. And most economists are applied economists where the economics is not really what's behind their applied, statistics is. And so McCloskey's criticism is that they focus on statistical significance, not economic significance. But that is our profession. But then I go back to the Buchanan line again and angels dancing on the head of a pin. Again, I'm biased because, Buchanan says something. If Buchanan ever comes into question, because remember, I was his student when he was old, so he's like a grandpa to me. So whenever Buchanan comes in, I see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil about the great Jim Buchanan, because it's like, your grandpa who was like, oh, here, it's nice or whatever. And, but yeah, surely he had his foibles just like everyone else does. They're human beings. They have, all these things. But when I read the archives, I see all this really great stuff. And
You're not a big fan of, what is it, Nancy McLean?
Okay, we're not going there right now. Hold on.
No, we won't. But I'll just say the following thing, which is that I was sent that book in its pre-publication version by the Wall Street Journal, and I was asked to write a review of it. And I wrote a review of it, and I gave it to Mike Munger and to Steve Horowitz, who were not aware of the book at the time that I gave it to them. My review is 45 pages long, and eventually it got published. But I realized as I was writing it that it made no sense for me to review it because I'm the poster child of everything that she hates. Because I went to graduate school on a fellowship from Charles Koch. While on a fellowship from Charles Koch, I studied with Jim Buchanan. I then left for 10 years and then came back to George Mason, where I work at the Mercatus Center, which is closely associated with Charles Koch. And I took over Jim Buchanan's classes. Now, I will tell you the following thing. Nancy McLean was at Jim Buchanan's memorial service. And I talked to her at the memorial service about the Buchanan archives. And so one of the things that pissed me off, in the beginning of the book, besides all kinds of other things, was she makes this big deal out of the mess that was the Buchanan archives. But she understood what the picture was. She just didn't tell it, which is that Buchanan had a memorandum of agreement with the university back in the 1990s, but he never retired. And the memorandum doesn't kick in until he's no longer working, because when you archive a place, you have to shut down the working, right? Everyone get out of the building. We're now going to work on the building. So the boxes and everything were all over the place. And then when he passed away, he had his apartment in Fairfax, his home in Blacksburg, all those boxes. And I know about them because I helped unload them from the truck, and they were just put in the center of the thing. And then she came in, and she was like rifling through. So it'd be like as if your grandfather just died and then someone was rifling through the papers before you could even organize them. And I'm talking to her. She knows all about it, but then she writes it as if like we've neglected his papers. We treated it. So I knew right from the start, something's going on here that wasn't like what she was up to when we were talking to her here. And then there's other issues, but if you're interested, again, send me an email and I'll send you a copy of my piece. I tried to be as balanced as I could be.
You don't need to be balanced with her. I'm going to reiterate my plea for the McFly Boettke meme. So all of you get working on that, and let's get Diego in here. Go ahead, Diego.
All right.
You said
I gotta do it to myself.
I send you treats.
I gotta do it to myself. Yeah. Go ahead, Diego.
Okay, thank you. I'm working on the book still, but something that caught my interest is that the definition of capitalism is like a decentralized organization of individual decision-making process. And what I'm seeing today, and I wanted to ask you, is that during the last couple of generations, during the last 70 years or so, the proportion of the participation of governments all over the world has
Yeah.
been increasing. So he claims that discovery process is a happy discovery always. So do you think that this smaller proportion of people trying to discover and not living in a chronic capitalism
Yeah.
is affecting the morality of our society? Because Finder Keeper's ethics is enjoyed by a smaller proportion of people every year.
Yeah.
So do you think that that is an accurate description?
Yeah. Let me I'll start by criticizing university faculty so that I'm not criticizing the world in general. But we have all kinds of, issues in universities. One of them is that we give tenure, lifetime employment to the faculty. Okay. And so that should make the faculty be what Mansur Olson calls a stationary bandit. So you're there, you're supposed to then, and if you're a stationary bandit, you try to work to improve the environment that you're in because you're in it. But the incentives within the university, since there's no residual claimant, so that means you can't reap any rewards from improving the environment, is that every single, they're a stationary bandit who acts like a roving bandit. The roving bandit comes in and tries to extract as much resources as possible from that. Okay. And so universities are this very, very weird, tip of the iceberg for society, because you have faculty members who are supposed to be there working to improve and sustain the educational environment of the university. But because of the incentives that they face, they end up by being Jabba the Hutt, and they just like sit fat, happy, and stupid and extract as much resources as possible. And so this is a very, very weird kind of thing, right, that's going on. Now, how about society in general? So Kerzner talks about the world that you're talking about, but it's in a different book. It's in a discussion of what he would call superfluous discovery, which is when we involve the state in all these things, we engage in discoveries, but the discoveries are not for mutually beneficial exchange. They're instead discoveries that send us in this direction or that direction, which may be wholly unproductive or, in fact, in many ways destructive. Okay. And so he calls that superfluous discovery. That's like the mercantilism thing. One of my favorite lines recently about this crony capitalism is from Randy Holcomb in a book having to do with political capitalism, where he talks about the issue of creative destruction. He says, look, you have to divide society in those who are ahead and those who want to get ahead. And those who are ahead hate this creative destruction because it knocks them off the top spot. Whereas those who want to get ahead, they want to be disruptors. They want to change everything. And so, just to give you an example, a couple of years ago, they were talking about trying to regulate the network economies, right? So they had Facebook, and Zuckerberg shows up at a hearing in DC. And at the hearing, Zuckerberg volunteered to be on the regulatory commission overseeing, the network economies. And I'm like, ding, 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 ding. George Stigler is in the building, right? Because it's like 101 kind of idea. Zuckerberg's like, I'll volunteer, no joke, right? I'd like to volunteer to regulate all economics professors. I could fix, Taylor's problem in a minute. Just ban everyone, So I think that we live in this world of privileges and power that we need to actually, as for sake of an argument here, as classical liberals, as libertarians, we need to be much harsher in our criticism of the existing system. Amy and I were just involved in a really great seminar on Adam Smith. And in one of the papers, the author quoted this passage from Smith from his letters, from his correspondence, in which he describes the wealth of nations as an aggressive critique of the commercial society of Britain out of his time. And she read that at first out of context, because you're like, see, he's criticizing wealth or whatever. No. He's criticizing mercantilism. He's criticizing the monopoly privileges. This is what Adam Smith is doing. And it's an aggressive critique. We need to be more aggressive about it. And we sometimes are shy because we can't decouple. Like, so for example, my criticisms of modern economy does not imply that I hate billionaires or that billionaires shouldn't exist. It's that billionaires shouldn't exist by getting special privileges from the government. Okay. Now I'm going to be a quasi political here for a second. So I grew up in the New York, New Jersey area, right? I hate Trump with a passion from the time I was like this high. All right. If you want to know anything about Trump, just look up Atlantic City Trump. All right. And you see what he did in Atlantic City. He stiffed contractors. He did all this stuff. He's a horrible human being. I can't believe that we're even talking about him being president a second time, let alone the first time. Okay. He is a quintessential crony capitalist. This is why and part of his issue, which is I agree with, is when he stands up and he says, I know how this system works. And he talks to Christian, seminar or whatever, and says, you came to my office and begging for, campaign contract. I know how this works. Of course he does, because that's the world that he lived in. Okay. A more severe term is one of our donors to Mercatus came up to me after my Living Economics book came out. And he says to me, I really like your book. He says, but you talk about cost in the book a lot. He goes, I'm in business for 30 years. I never worried about costs once. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I said, what business were you in? He said, I sold high-end optics to the United States Air Force. And I was like, yep, you didn't worry about costs, right? Because that's not that. And this is the issue. So we want a system of property contracted consent, right? We want to have institutions that are guardrails against the power and privilege. And part of the emancipatory message of liberalism and libertarianism is that we're going to eradicate this positions of these power and privileges. And so what does that look like when you get? So Taylor asked, can Austrian economics have an influence in public policy? Well, of course it has over the years and whatnot. But like right now in Argentina, I don't know enough to comment on whether or not this is like a crazy person or whatnot. But the reality is that when he sits there and talks about what he needs, those are the things that need to be done. If you listen to Balcerowicz in 1990, you would have heard the same thing in Poland, that he's talking about. It's just that now we see it on social media and he's a little bit more dramatic. Balcerowicz was, behind closed doors and working through like a nerdy kind of economist. And this guy, is on with a chainsaw and, all these kind of things like that. So he has a kind of populist issue, but I have no idea if he's going to be like sincere or go the other way because, you should remember in recent times, like for example, Viktor Orban promised to be, a great liberal. Modi, I'm going to bring liberalism to India. And then the next thing you know, he brings religious wars, Erdogan, go back in the beginning when he first took it over in Turkey, right? He was supposed to being a liberal. So a lot of these guys that say that they're liberals, they end up by, as politics gets in the way, they end up by becoming authoritarians of some stripe or another. So I don't want to say that, but you can have, this guy is actually quoting Israel Kirzner in his speech at Davos, right? So that's like, I guarantee you, going back to your question, that most people in the room are like, who did he just mention? Like, I don't know that guy. Is it Milton Friedman? I don't know. He got the name wrong or something, that kind of thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question, though. Scott, do you still have your hand up?
I do, but if anybody wants to jump in, I took some time on the front end. If not, I'll rip it off.
Yeah, you're the only one on there.
So my comment on the Austrian economics and the the prevalence of it is, and this kind of goes back to a post that I made. Austrian economics needs a marketing department. My actual question is related to your comments on Jerry Goss and Dave Schmitz and the Arizona school and non-ideal theorizing. My philosopher friend is at the University of San Diego. He claims that he's a libertarian with a bleeding heart. He did his doctoral work under Dave Schmitz.
Yeah, this is Matt Zielinski.
Yeah.
Yeah.
one of the things I had lunch with him a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things he said to me that kind of caught me by surprise, but kind of ties into what you were saying earlier, I think, is the idea of values or moral pluralism. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you gravitate towards moral or value pluralism yourself?
Wow, that is a big question to ask. Let me just like break it down, and I'm going to try to be quick because I want Mark and Barry to
Yeah,
get in
and
here.
you can skip it if you want. Let those
No,
guys.
no, let me just take a stab at it because it is what Kerzner. So Kerzner's book is a very interesting book because it's the most positive economic analysis of normative issues you'll ever read. Right? So it's like a weird mix. It's not a normative analysis of a normative issue. It's a positive economic analysis. He's trying to explain the functional significance of profits and then why it is that they should be morally justified precisely because of the functional significance of them. That's the finders keepers ethic, right? If you can't keep what it is that you go and discover, then you're not going to engage in discovering. If you don't engage in discovering, you don't get progress. And so we stall, right? So, all right. So back to Matt's point. So I think that one of the issues is that we don't want to be in a world which says that I can get a libertarian world because everyone in it is a libertarian. So that means that we have to actually allow for people that have extreme different value structure, value scales than us. And we have to figure out ways in which we can live peacefully and prosperously with one another rather than at war with one another. And so this is why I'm a cosmopolitan liberal and all the things that go with being a cosmopolitan liberal. What Kant said to us was that the two ideals is strangers nowhere in the world. So that would imply the free mobility of labor and capital. And the other one is this quest for perpetual peace. I think that Kant's right, that that's what we should strive to live by. And what our task is to find those institutional patterns that approximate those aspirations. And so, yeah. So but let me just, and then I'll shut up after this, but I think you raise a very good point, Scott, about the issue having to do with there has to be some shared agreement of some basic values. Otherwise, we can't even get off the ground. So one of those is that peace is preferred to destruction, right? If you believe that the world is a zero-sum game, right, or a negative-sum game, you're not going to see the opportunities for positive-sum game. And I think this is part of the problem that people are identifying with things like post-colonialism, because they split the world into the oppressed and the oppressors. And their answer is let the oppressed now oppress. Those who were oppressed, let them now become the ones who oppress the oppressors, right? Rather than the idea that we can find ways to live better together. But that might require, for example, values shifts. We just had a talk by Timur Kuran here, who has a book out right now called Freedom Delayed. And in Timur Kuran's talk, he was stressing the fact that in the Islamic religion, they've never had a reformation like we had in the Christian religion. And part of the issue is that affects the way they deal with organizations, the way they tax, and most importantly, the way they deal with apostates. They have no way to deal with dissenters other than excommunication. And so as a result, they can't have the kind of intellectual discourse, even in societies that actually de-emphasize the cleric. The institutional legacy is in those societies, and it prevents them from having the kind of modern economic growth. That's his thesis. But note his title is freedom delayed, not freedom denied. So it is possible, but you're going to have to go through some changes. And so the value systems of that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Mark. You're on mute.
Is that better?
Yep.
As I fill out my NCAA basketball, you got any hidden gems in there?
I am screwed because I thought that McClure was going to be back for the NCAA tournament from Kansas, and I just read this morning that he's not out. He's out for the tournament. So, yeah.
Watch out for Purdue. Braden Smith is.
Yeah,
hurt.
he's amazing. But their coach always blows it. But anyway, that's an issue there. But I have Connecticut winning.
That's what
and I have them beating Houston. So those are like the most bland choices that anyone could have.
That's the other thing on war. I'm reading War and Peace for the first time. I've sort of gotten on this 1800s Russian literature kick. But Tolstoy in War and Peace explains the whole thing of war, that it's inevitable, people get caught up in it, Napoleon, and that his take on war is wonderful in there.
Oh yeah. We can't take that book for one of the reading group books.
I know. It's only taken me 3 months to get this book, so.
Yeah,
I mean, that'd be before Rand, Pete, but
Yes. Yeah, I ruined Ayn Rand for my wife when we were in college, because when I gave her Atlas Shrugged, I kept on asking her, "Did you get the speech yet? You get the speech yet?" And I was like, because I read it in like a fever pitch and she read it like a normal person. And I was like, come on, like, come on, what are you doing? So by the time she got to the speech, she was like, this damn speech, who the hell does that? Goes off on a 90-minute talk. So. But yeah, I mean, my colleague Chris Coyne is doing some very, very good work on war, and I would recommend looking at his stuff. Barry, you have to go away. No, there you are.
Hi. Yes, hi. Sorry, just juggling child as well this evening. Always fun. I was just going to sort of say from experience in local government that the politicians are so limited in terms of resources that actually they kind of look at things like those data points as there's a big difference between a sort of zip codes in terms of outcomes or something. Whereas there's a flag, there's something interesting to look at. And because they're limited in resources to tackle those, there's a sense in which if you've got a coherent story to explain how to make changes or why those differences come about, they're going to be more interested in that simply because of the economic necessity. So I think there may well be a lot more opportunity to push over out of the agenda into sort of local decision makers, perhaps, than at the national level, simply because of restraint that they face or constraints they're facing. So that's just a thought that all the sort of good work that Kate has been doing on things like the hurricane recovery efforts down in New Orleans, that sort of would speak very well to the kind of issues that local government tends to be addressing elsewhere.
Yeah, so just to focus on the issue that I think is just to sort of come to an end here, I'm not an expert on this, but when I read Roland Fryer talk about school performance and kids, he focuses on practices. So one of the things that he did was he went into the poorest sections of Houston and introduced tutoring, because he noticed that actually tutorials were what rich parents were having their kids do in other sections. So if we could then provide that will actually have greater returns, right? I don't know if you ever watched the Freakonomics show, but the original idea was that we're going to pay the students. That was Fryer's original idea that then Levitt and Lists try to run with. Fryer's a funny duck. We had him here to give a talk, and he told us all how he knew he found his wife. So on their very first date, he took her to a very nice restaurant and he pulled out a stack of of dollar bills, right? So a big stack of dollar bills, and he put it on the table to the waiter. And he said to the waiter, he goes, each time you give me bad service, I'm going to take one of these away. But if you give us good service, you'll have this whole stack. Right. And so he was incentivizing the waiter. And he said he said it achieved two things. One, he had the best service he's ever had. Two, he found his wife because she didn't run away screaming at this thought experiment that he did. All right. So, this is so he's sitting there, he's looking at, performance. And he's like, okay, how can I get a kid in inner city Chicago to move from being a C student to being a B student? Or how can I get that kid to move from being a B student to being an A student? He said, why don't we pay him? He goes, that's what mommy and daddy do in the rich sections. So, if the kid is in say, Lake, I think this is right, Lake Forest, Illinois, they're going to be rich there and everything. And the parents say, oh, look, if you graduate with straight A's, we'll give you a car, or, we do this, and they give those kind of reward things. So he says, why can't we do that with the inner city kids? And if you remember, what happens in the Freakonomics thing is they end up by the kids don't respond because they gave them $500. And they can make more money from $500 by selling drugs than they could by, And so then they're sitting in their office as the thing is ending, and they're like, what if we gave them $5,000? What if we gave them $50,000? We gave them $50,000. Would they behave differently than $5,000? And so at that point, all they're talking about is movements along a demand curve and a supply curve. Okay. All right. So that was originally what Fryer wanted to go and do. But then he started focusing on not just paying the students, because he didn't want to pay the teachers because he thought teaching to the test is the wrong way to get improved school performance. So he's not going to pay the teachers. He was going to pay the students. But then he said, what we really have to do is we have to have practices and teach the students what are and so tutoring was one of the main ones. What Chetty wants to do is move people from a zip code. So, see, this zip code B is good. This zip code A is bad. Let's take the people that have the good aptitude tests in A, move them to B, and then we'll get the same outcome. You see? Different policy. That's a different policy. That's all. I would prefer the Fryer one, but a lot of people don't like it because they think it's blaming the victim in some sense, because it's putting the idea of the practices front and center rather than the circumstances. And a lot of people want the circumstances to be the driver rather than the practices. I want to put the practices front and center and recognize that practices are constrained by circumstances. I'm not denying the role of circumstances, but it's practices within those circumstances that are volitional, and they're on individuals to choose. Okay. I'm doing the McFly on myself, Amy.
No, that was actually kind of perfect timing, Pete. We went a couple of minutes over, but I'm sure no one minds. Thanks for coming today. We'll have a happy hour or something next month. And don't forget that next week we have our sort of official virtual salon on the Kersner book with our friend Rosalino Candela. And look for some more on Cowan's GOAT and quote contests in the portal. See y'all next week.